Hi everyone. Can everyone see and hear me okay? I see some nodding. Hello, my name is Samantha Hill.
Yeah.
I am the Assistant Director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities here at Bard College. And this spring we are reading Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem. And today we are going to be talking about the first two chapters, The Accused and An Expert on the Jewish Question. So, what I'm going to do is just kind of get us started thinking about who is Adolf Eichmann and how is Hannah Arendt thinking about Eichmann and encountering Eichmann. So, one of the things, just a couple of preliminary notes before we jump into that in the text. One of the things that we touched on last week, and that I've been really struck by in the past month or so, writing a biography of Arendt and having to dig into, the kind of journey she undertook to go to Israel and cover the trial. In her personal correspondence, especially with her husband, Heinrich Blücher, is how frustrated she was from the beginning of the trial. And she was frustrated in her correspondence, which I think comes through in other ways in this chapter, in these two chapters, by two things primarily. One was the show trial, which Roger was talking about last week, but specifically in that, she was really frustrated by the fact that for days on end, for weeks on end, nobody even talked about Eichmann at the trial, that there were no questions for Eichmann, and that it was a series of other questions and other testimony. And so the trial wasn't specifically always engaging Eichmann the person, right? So this question of who is Eichmann is important for Arendt, and it's important for how she's thinking about justice and how she's thinking about how we can try somebody like Eichmann and what consequences that has for thinking about the crimes against humanity and the other questions that are being put on trial. So the other thing that Arendt was incredibly frustrated by from the beginning was the persona of Eichmann. And I think that really comes out in both of these chapters. And she was frustrated by a couple of different things. She at the end of in the last part of the Origins of Totalitarianism, which she published in 1951, right? So Eichmann's captured in 1961, 10 years later. But at the end of Origins in 1951, she makes two arguments that she's also going to retract when she comes face to face with Eichmann. One is that the emergence of totalitarianism created holes of oblivion. She's going to say that there's simply, there are too many people in the world to fundamentally erase the presence of other people. And the other that really comes through in our reading for today is the notion of radical evil, right? And this is, of course, the underpinning thesis of Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. But she is going to almost immediately in her private letters realize that this is not a question of radical evil, that this is not some new form of evil that has somehow phenomenally appeared in the world. Right, so for Arendt, Eichmann is not this cold, calculating, rational monster. He's a clown. He's a clown, and he's a joiner. He's a braggart, which is important, and he's incapable of any original thought. Right, so I think one of the questions that we can talk about today is, did Arendt get Eichmann right? And this is a huge debate in contemporary Arendt scholarship and has been a debate since Arendt published these articles in the New Yorker and the book, right? So Arendt is insistent on the fact that Eichmann is not somehow maliciously manipulating the audience that he's addressing in these proceedings, right? She doesn't think he's hiding some true, raging, anti-Semitism, monstrous nature. She thinks that he's remarkably boring, right? She finds him remarkably boring. And it's not that he's incapable of thought, it's that he's incapable of thinking. She thinks he's unable to think outside of the the storehouse of Nazi cliches, right, that have been fed to him by the ministers of propaganda, by Himmler and so on, right? So there's a question of whether or not Arendt is perceiving Eichmann right, I think. And I think that's a question that we can talk about, and I'm sure that there are different opinions about that, right? So when Arendt read Eichmann's interview that he gave when he was captured in Argentina, and then when she listened to him speaking, she thought that the longer one listened to him, the more obvious it became that his inability to speak, she says, was connected to his inability to think, right? And precisely his inability to think from the viewpoint of anybody else, right? So it's not that Eichmann doesn't think. He's obviously very good at his job, which he brags about, right? The fact that he's a braggart, which she emphasizes here, is one of the reasons why he was ultimately captured. It's that he is incapable of thinking from the viewpoint of anybody else. So I think she says that on page 49, and I have this edition. And because of this, she says no communication with him is possible, right? And so in her interview with Joachim Fest in the 70s, she's, I think 72, I can't quite remember. Bob, you're sharing your screen accidentally. I think it's Bob. Oh no, not Bob. That's a comment. I see that just popped up. Somebody is sharing their screen. If you could just, I don't see your name. You're wearing a gray sweater and you have your hand across your mouth though. So if you could, yes, could you? Okay, thank you. Sorry, right? So she describes it as speaking to a brick wall, right? So there is no dialogue with Eichmann. There's no dialogic process of thought. There's no conversational process of thought. He's incapable of this self-reflective, critical thinking process. And if you were in our virtual reading group from last fall, we spent a lot of time talking about that in Hannah Arendt's book on thinking and what it is she's thinking about thinking as a process that we engage in, what she calls 2-in-1 thinking, where one has a conversation with oneself. So he's not capable of thinking from the standpoint of anybody else, right? Speaking to him is like speaking to a brick wall. There's no back and forth, right? So when he's asked these difficult questions in the trial, he responds with cliches. He responds with stock phrases, and she gives us a few examples of these in the text. He's not giving us his response to what is being asked of him. And for her, this is an incapacity, right? It's an incapacity for thinking, for the critical activity of thinking. And the other part of this lack of capacity for thinking, in Arendt's sense, is that Eichmann is fundamentally a joiner, right? He has a joiner mentality. And he is anxious, right? He wants to be successful. He wants to take orders, right? He is, so at the end of Origins, to go back to that text, when she's talking about loneliness, right? One of the reasons why loneliness makes us susceptible to totalitarian propaganda is because when you're lonely, you need meaning. You're hungry for meaning. And Eichmann had this need for meaning that couldn't come from within himself. He needed to be a joiner. He needed the ideology of the movement to give himself meaning. He wasn't able to live without taking commands from others. And I think she emphasizes that, when he went to Argentina, when he fled to not be, to escape capture, one of the reasons why he was captured is because he wasn't satisfied with the routineness of everyday life. He wanted his actions to be known at some level. He wanted the recognition for how successful he had been. And he bragged about it. He always was trying to impress people. And he was bored, right? He became bored in some way. And he needed meaning, right? And so let me see. I'll pause for a second. So Arendt isn't arguing that Eichmann simply followed orders, right? It's not that he's simply following orders. It's that he, so he's not just the cog in the machine, right? He is prideful, right? And he takes initiative, right? He is intentionally acting in a way to be successful at his job, at deporting people. And he has a willingness to obey, but it's not just a blind willingness to obey. He's actively trying to climb the ladder, right? And he cares about what it is that he's doing. And so one of the other things that Arendt emphasizes here is Eichmann's refusal to follow Himmler's orders in 1944. And instead, he organized the death marches for the Hungarian Jewish people. And he, instead of, so Eichmann was a loyalist, right? In that sense, I think. He was a joiner. And so these different elements of Eichmann's personality, I think, go together in Arendt's reading of Eichmann, right? He wasn't just following orders. He was an active joiner. He wanted to be successful. He wasn't content with everyday life. He wanted acclaim. He was a braggart. Now, the question that I think haunts a lot of people is Arendt's, is there an underemphasis on whether or not he is anti-Semitic and motivated by anti-Semitic motivations? For Arendt, that's not the primary factor in Eichmann's personal motivation, right? It's not that he has this deeply felt, internalized hatred of the Jewish people. It's that he has this kind of simple joiner, unthinking, braggart personality, and that he found a place in this ideological organization where he was able to be successful. Now, that doesn't mean he wasn't anti-Semitic, and I think she makes that clear, and makes that clear in later chapters, but for her, that's not where the emphasis is. I think she's asking us to wrestle with a moral question of, what enables people to engage in these kinds of acts of evil, right? Because Eichmann is not, he's not a monster. He's a man of bone and flesh and blood who was born to parents who had children, who had a wife, right? And he made decisions, and his way of being was informed by his self, by his thinking about himself, and what he wanted and where he found meaning, right? And she paints him as this clownish figure in a way where has this kind of flat personality. He's not this cold, calculating, vindictive mastermind who has this, raging anti-Semitism. He's an unthinking, braggart joiner, incapable of finding meaning in his own life, who wants to join a movement. Okay. Um, so let's see. So in one of the, I'm going to stop there actually. I think that's a good place to stop. I think those are the kind of key elements. I think there are a lot of different points in the text where Arendt gives us different examples that we can pick up on. I have some more notes, but I think that's maybe a good place to pause. Roger, do you want to jump in there if you're on and add something or?
Hi everyone. Hi Sam.
I
Um, I think it might be worthwhile to address a little bit about what are called the Sasson Papers and
okay.
some of the critiques of Arendt that have been based on them. So for some of you know this that after the war, Eichmann was able to make his way largely through the help of a sort of underground railroad of sorts, eventually to Argentina, and joined a large group of Nazis, former Nazis and Nazis living in Argentina under an assumed name, and lived there from I guess like 45 or 46 until he was kidnapped by the Israelis in 1960. Near the end of his stay, he went through a number of interviews with a former Nazi news reporter named Sasson, and those were taped, and they were actually going to be used for a book that Sasson was going to write on Eichmann, and Eichmann hoped that this book would help resurrect his reputation in Germany. There's some evidence that he even thought that, or Sasson at least thought, that it could be used to bring back the Nazi Party into Germany. And Eichmann also worked on his own autobiography and some other texts, and I think a novel of sorts at this time. Anyway, when he was kidnapped, some of these papers were published in the journal Life and in some other publications, and the Israeli court had some of them that Arendt was able to look at. So I think one of the most interesting, important, and maybe unsolvable questions, and it's one that Sam raised, and I think it's right to raise, is there is an argument about whether Arendt was wrong or right to do two things. One is to suggest that while Eichmann lied repeatedly, as she says, I mean, she thinks lying is endemic to his character. She doesn't think he lied so much to try and fool the court. She thinks he lies to himself about certain things. And the second is that Arendt thought that while he certainly drank the Kool-Aid of anti-Semitism of the time, he wasn't a raving anti-Semite. Bettina Stengneth, who's an independent scholar based in Hamburg in Germany, is one of the only people who's been given and has access to the entire Sasson Papers and Sasson tapes, which she won't let other people actually access. But she has written a book, Eichmann for Jerusalem, or Eichmann before Jerusalem, which is all about Eichmann before the trial, and it's largely centered around these Sasson interviews, and that book has been used to make the case, partly that she makes and partly that she doesn't, that Arendt really got Eichmann wrong, and I think it's important to at least acknowledge that book is out there. She does think that she says in her book that Eichmann was more anti-Semitic than Arendt thought him to be. She doesn't provide much evidence for that, I have to be honest.
I agree with that.
I've read her book very closely and reviewed it a number of times, and I actually spent a full day with her in Hamburg arguing about some of these issues. And what she does present evidence of is that Eichmann was a convinced Nazi, at least by the 1940s, and still largely in Argentina. But all the evidence she brings to bear on that is that Eichmann thought that the Germans were fighting a war to the death. He had to fight against his enemies. He fought for the fatherland. All these kind of claims, and I think when Arendt says things like he had no beliefs or he didn't have any strong convictions, I think she probably may have not realized that he did have at least one strong conviction. And actually I don't think Arendt would disagree with this, but it wasn't an ideological conviction against Jews per se. It was for the Nazi Party as a movement, and as Sam said, as being a joiner and being a member of this movement. And that's what Eichmann really took an enormous amount of pride and belief in. And so one thing, and I'm happy to talk more about the Sasson Papers and these interviews, which have been widely used. I mean, Mark Lilla and others have argued that if Arendt now saw the Sasson Papers, she would obviously change her view on Eichmann. I think that's simply an irresponsible argument to make, because when Mark Lilla does that, he offers a series of quotations that if Arendt had seen, he says would have changed her opinion. But all of those quotations are from the published part of the Eichmann Papers that Arendt read and quotes in this book. So if you're going to have this conversation, and this is where I'll end what I want to say right now, you have to ask yourself, if Arendt did know most of what Stengnuth and Lilla and others say are in the Sasson Papers that convince them that she got it wrong, and yet she still says what she says, you have to ask, maybe, what is her argument, right? What is she trying to say? And it's not simply that she didn't know the facts. She knew the facts, and what she thought was, as Samantha said, that Eichmann may have had anti-Semitism, may have been anti-Semitic, surely was a Nazi, but what made him do what he did was not some lunacy, not some crazed, monstrous behavior, but a deep desire to be part of this Nazi movement. And that this desire to join and this inability to think from the perspective of the other. That's the one other thing I'm going to point. I mean, the pages in the book that we read for today, that were in the second chapter that you read, Expert on the Jewish Question, the pages where she's talking about his conversation with Avner Less, the German Israeli captain who interrogated Eichmann for days and days on end. And what she says is, he sat there and poured his heart out to Avner Less, hoping for sympathy. And this is really, I think, this is one of the examples that Arendt most builds her case on. He simply could not think from the perspective of somebody else. He could not imagine that a German Jew in Israel would find Eichmann's plea for sympathy about how hard his life was to be ludicrous. And he actually expected to get sympathy from Avner Less. And that's the kind of utter stupidity, banality, thoughtlessness that Arendt finds in Eichmann. That really is, I think, the foundation of her insight that he was more banal than evil. And that's where I think the book is based. And so trying to understand that is absolutely essential if you want to try and make sense of her reading of Eichmann in the book. So maybe we'll, there's a lot of questions already. Sam, do you want to start taking some of those?
Can I ask a question? This is Margaret. Sam, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Margaret.
Sorry, I muted my microphone. Yes, hi, Margaret.
Yeah, no, I have the same edition that Samantha, that you were just showing. And one of the most interesting parts of today's reading for me was on page 50, where she's discussing exactly what Roger was just talking about, the, Captain Less interviews. And where she says about you down the page, these very words, and she lists a bunch, triggered in him a mechanism that had become two-thirds completely unalterable. And she never really says, where did this mechanism come from? You know, is it inviolate? Can it be undone? What is it? And I kept expecting there to be some sort of unpacking of what she meant by mechanism there. Is it really simply what you and Roger have just been about, that he just, you know, drank the Kool-Aid, wanted to be part of the team, and so he said what they said? Or is it something more?
Margaret, where is the word mechanism? I'm having trouble.
It's in the
Where
middle
is
of page 58. Just to be clear, she says the very word SS or Career or Himmler appeared in him a mechanism that has been completely alterable. And so I think what you're saying is
five lines up from the beginning paragraph that starts about 3/4 of the way down the page.
on page 50.
Yep.
I read it, right? The sentence begins, the very words SS or Career or Himmler, and then there's a long parenthetical, triggered in him a mechanism that has become completely unalterable. The presence of Captain Less, a Jew from Germany, and unlikely in any case to think that members of the SS advanced in their careers through the exercise of a high moral qualities, did not for a moment throw this mechanism out of gear. You know, I'm happy to hear more psychologically trained people than me comment on that. I take it to mean that he had sort of an autopilot. This is part of her idea of him as someone who thought in cliches. And so when he heard SS, he went into what an SS was. When he heard Career, he went into his career. When he heard Himmler, he went into how Himmler, you know, what he thought of Himmler. These were not things that he had a whole lot of reflection on. That's what I take to be Arendt's meaning here.
And I think it's worth emphasizing, in addition, that she, you know, she finds it laughable, right? She sees this kind of response comedically, which is part of what got her in trouble for the book, is the ironic tone where she's kind of drawing the reader into the horror of the comedy that she's watching unfolding in Eichmann's responses. It's a kind of, you know, I think this is where the metaphor of the brick wall is really useful in thinking about that term mechanism, because it's, you know, have you ever just talked to someone and they're like on some kind of autopilot and like they say two sentences and they pick one word out of that and then they go on like
nowadays a lot.
Yeah, that, you know, they're not actually listening to what it is that you're saying or the meaning of what you're saying or thinking about what it is that you're saying. They pick up one word,
right,
which hits somewhere in their brain, and then they just give you a pre-rehearsed spiel that is not actually reflective of the present moment that you're in. And I think, you know, that's the brick wall metaphor where the ball, you know, I think of it almost as, you know, like the ball bouncing off the wall. It just hits in that place and comes back, and it's a mechanism. It's not the active, engaged process of thinking.
So, I mean, I guess the reason this disturbed me was that, you know, then it makes me think, well, if I go back to other things we've read in VRG, does that mean that only some of the people who are already predisposed to thinking and don't have those brick walls can now think, and the others are just lost? How do you puncture that brick wall? Is there a way? Can it really be the case that she's saying that's a done deal forever and ever?
No, I mean that's what teaching is, but it's more. I mean, I think there are ways to reach people, right? I mean, that's at least our hope. I think not everybody. I mean, let's be clear. You know, strong ideological people who really can't see outside of a worldview are very hard to reach. I mean, I'm sure many of you in the last few years especially have had conversations with people. I certainly have them, unfortunately, too often these days, where they just come at you as if you are in one box and they're in another, and there's no way you're ever going to have a conversation with them, and you have to make a decision at some point when to cut and cut and run. But I think the hope is that many of us are at least open to seeing the world from another point of view. I don't think you can be taught that by being slapped on the wrist or spanked or whatever. But as Kant told you, and as Arendt emphasizes in her reading of Kant, you learn that through the example. You learn that through the examples of other people who think and who make an effort to question themselves. And, that's the struggle we're in. And at a time like now, when many, many people are closing themselves off in very hermetically sealed conversational bubbles, it's sometimes pretty depressing and hard to remember and think with some hope that this kind of thinking that Arendt talks about is possible. And yet I think it is, and I think that's what we all have to continue to try and do.
I think it is too, and I just want to say, I think a question that we can talk about there as well is, what is happening to language today? And how does what is happening to language in the political sphere affect our ability to form these kinds of meaningful relationships where we can open up these ideological bubbles as well. It looks like
I'm wondering if that's just about ideology. If I can jump in. I mean, I think these are tools we have to be reflective and to self-inspect. And if it turns out that those tools are going to put us in harm's way, I mean, Roger said we turn these off. That means we have them, right? And I don't know that it's a given that Eichmann didn't have them. I just don't see how it was to his advantage to think from another's perspective in the positions he had found himself in. Again, he claims all these choices were made almost seemingly without intention where he ended up, but where he was not aware of the quality that he was going into in the division of the SS that he found himself in. But if he were to do the right thing as we think is the right thing from a moral perspective, how would that be in his best interest if he's guided mostly by self-interest, especially in the warped world that he was living in, where mendacity is the coin of the realm?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I'm not sure Arendt's answer is satisfying always. I think part of what I hear in your question, Peter, is, how do we motivate somebody to put the good of the collective ahead of the good of the individual when it's to their personal advantage? And so in like Arendt's essay on personal responsibility under dictatorship, I think she says it the most clearly, like laying out the argument. And she says, what's the difference between people who went along with and people who resisted? And people who resisted chose to think. And that, I think in that thinking, in that choosing to think, there's a moral argument. And for her, it's a kind of Kantian argument about retaining the harmony of the soul. So in that essay, and in the chapter on thinking in the life of the mind, she gives the example of King Richard III from Shakespeare, I think it is, in this, if you murder, if you engage in activities that are morally wrong and damaging, not because they're morally wrong because you're breaking the law or codified norms in any sense, but because you're fundamentally rejecting the plurality of the human condition, because you're killing another person, because you're ending the life of another who has just as much right to exist as you do, you have to spend the rest of your life in a compromised state where you will never be able to be in harmony with yourself. And because you are always out of harmony with yourself, because you're living with a murderer, you can't think, because your partner in thinking, your conversation partner, the voice that mediates the intent and the will and the way that you act, is compromised. And I think that's really important to Arendt's conception of self-reflective thinking there.
Right.
Roger, you look like you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I think what Sam is saying is right, but I also think that what Peter is offering or is protesting, I think, is right too, which is, what's going to make someone like Eichmann do that? Can he do it?
Yeah.
And I think I think the internal dialogue, that the idea that people can think, that Sam is talking about, is right. But I also want to say that I believe for Arendt, the number of people who are going to do that is very few.
Hi, I'd like to make a point. So I'd like to push back on that concept a little bit, because I think there's a big degree of indifference. I mean, to some degree, everyone living in a world with a lot of people you can't know personally develop a degree of indifference to people you don't know. And my question is, how much of what we're talking about is not really not thinking, but instead utilizing the tools that people use in society, indifference, like soldiers in war, like ignoring killing, to make it unpersonal and depersonalize it rather than not thinking. I feel like not thinking gives him a little bit, almost too much of an out. I'm not sure I believe he didn't think. I think he was just purely indifferent to the condition of others, as were many people in many countries and are today too.
So Julie, of course, he was intelligent, Arendt says. He just didn't think. There's a difference. And she has something particular that she means by thinking, which Samantha was talking about, which is, to some degree, being able and willing to see the world from the perspective of others. What I wanted to add, and I think this speaks to your question, although I'm not entirely sure, is that even Eichmann, she says, could have acted differently. And one of the biggest reasons he didn't is that he never encountered other people who questioned what he did. So if you look at page 51 to 52, the bottom of 51 to 52, and she'll talk about this a lot more later in the book, but here's one place where she does it. She asks a series of questions. Is this a textbook case of bad faith, of lying self-deception, combined with outrageous stupidity? So was he just so stupid that he couldn't really, that he just lied to himself and said he couldn't do anything else? Or is it simply the case of an eternally unrepentant criminal, someone who murders and rapes, but has no sense of repentance? And she says Eichmann's case is different from that of the ordinary criminal who can shield himself effectively against the reality of non-criminal world only within narrow limits of his gang. Eichmann needed only to recall the past in order to feel assured that he was not lying and that he was not deceiving himself, for he and the world he lived in had once been in perfect harmony. And later in the book, what Arendt is going to say is that when Eichmann was asked at one point, did anybody ever question him and say, what are you doing? This is wrong. He said, no one did. No religious figure, no higher up, no professor, no Jews, none of the people he worked with said, how can you do this? This is wrong. And I think that's what you were talking about, Julie. Maybe I misunderstood it. I don't know. But it's the fact that he was living in a world where simply everybody accepted this as the only way things could be. I'll just make a quick comment. There's a new movie out by Terrence Malick, one of the great movie makers of our time, called A Hidden Life. about Franz Jägerstätter, who was beatified a couple of years ago by Pope Benedict, but was a conscientious resistor in Austria. And he resisted the war. He was killed for it. But it took over 2 years for him to be from his arrest to his conviction and murder and guillotine. And in the movie, at least, and this is why I bring it up, numerous people in the Nazi bureaucracy, including high ups, go to great lengths to try and get Jägerstätter to sign the loyalty oath to Hitler. Why? Why don't they just kill the man? And the answer is because his presence as someone who refuses to do this was something that made them uncomfortable. Because he stood up and said, "This I cannot do." His thinking, now there's a criticism of the movie in the sense that he was really Christian and he may have been ideological as opposed to thinking. But if you accept the fact that he was someone who was willing to think and resist the Nazi commands and the Nazi order, the fact that they didn't want to just kill him, they wanted him to confess, they wanted him to be like them, is, I think, a deep part of what's going on, and which is why I was saying it matters that there are people, even the few people, who do think and are different, because they will, by their simply standing apart, make others think, or at least make them almost think. And that's why it's important to have people who do stand apart and think. If they don't, then the world becomes this harmonious world of perfect harmonious evil that I think you see in in a military situation like you're talking about, Julie, if I've understood your question. And that's why it's so important to have people who do think and stand up.
Roger, can you hear
Yeah.
me? This is Scott McLean. How are you? I had one observation that I haven't heard brought up in anything that I've read, trying to make a distinction between Arendt's notion of the banality, the non-thinking aspect of evil and true radical evil. I think a good illustration of this is if you watch the Nuremberg trials, Hermann Goering, who clearly was part of the inner circle of everything, even he had to look away when the images of the Holocaust were on the screen. And I truly think, although he deserved to die, he deserved his punishment, I truly think he really was repulsed, and he really, I'm not saying that snapped him to confessing or snapped him to feeling the cause was wrong, but I think visually seeing the Holocaust images on the screen truly disgusted and repulsed him. He turned away, and if you see the video, in disgust, whereas Julian Streicher was like rubbing his hands and like loving it. It was almost like he was watching a pornographic video, And so to me, that is a very an illustration of someone who, Goering is brilliant in terms of his IQ and intellect. But even he, who was the number 2 man next to Hitler, had to turn and recoil. But Julian Streicher didn't. Julian Streicher would have asked for the sequel to the stuff that was being shown. And to me, that is a really good distinction. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Roger, could I jump in for a minute, please?
Yeah. I'll answer that other question too, or Sam will, but why don't we let some other people speak?
So here, someone's microphone is on. I don't.
Scott, can you turn off your mic?
Mine.
Sorry. Thanks.
So the year I was born, 1947, Dr. Gilbert was the psychologist at the Nuremberg trials and had access to everybody who was on trial. And interestingly, he spoke German. And so these folks just opened up to him because he conducted all of his interviews in German, which made it easier for him. So I just want to read something quickly because it really, I have his book. It's a fantastic book. It's his diary of the whole time he spent at Nuremberg. And this is an afternoon in Colonel Huss. He's the fellow who ran Auschwitz. I don't know if I'm saying his name right. My German's terrible. After completing today's test, Hurst said, I suppose you want to know in this way if my thoughts and habits are normal. Well, what do you think? I asked. I am entirely normal. Even while I was doing this extermination work, I led a normal family life and so on. Did you have a normal social life? Well, perhaps it's a peculiarity of mine, but I always felt best alone. If I had worries, I tried to work them out myself. That was the thing that disturbed my wife most. And he goes on to talk about himself. But the part I really want to read is this. I asked him if he had ever considered whether the Jews whom he had murdered were guilty or had in any way deserved such a fate. Again, he tried patiently to explain that there was something unrealistic about such a question because he had been living in an entirely different world. Don't you see, we SS men were not supposed to think about these things. It never even occurred to us. And besides, it was something already taken for granted that the Jews were to blame for everything. I pressed him for some explanation of why it was taken for granted. Well, we just never heard anything else. It was not just newspapers like the Stürmer, but it was everything we ever heard. Even our military and ideological training took for granted that we had to protect Germany from the Jews. It only started to occur to me after the collapse that maybe it was not quite right, after I heard what everybody was saying. But nobody had ever said these things before. At least we never heard it before.
Yeah,
Now
Harold,
I wonder if Himmler really believed all that himself, or he just gave me an excuse to justify what he wanted me to do. But anyway, that really didn't matter. We were all trained to obey orders without even thinking that the thought of disobeying an order would simply never have occurred to anyone. And somebody else would have done just as well if I hadn't. Himmler was so strict about little things and executed SS men for such small offenses that we naturally took it for granted that he was acting according to a strict code of honor. You can be sure that it was not always a pleasure to see those mountains of corpses and smell the continual burning, but Himmler had ordered it and even explained the necessity, and I really never gave much thought to whether it was wrong. It just seemed a necessity.
So I would, if Julie is still on, I think what Scott and Harold have just offered is, I'd love to hear Julie's comment on it in this sense. You have people like Streicher who are what someone like what Arendt would say is a crazy, insane anti-Semite. I mean, he was the editor of Der Stürmer.
Yeah.
I mean, crazy. But you have a lot of other people who we called, or like the decent one. There was a movie made about Himmler recently called The Decent One, Der Anständige. And again, here's a guy who, while he was doing the most horrific things, was writing, banal love letters to his family in his diary and things like that. And so I guess what I think is interesting about Arendt's view, Julie, and I'd love to hear you comment on it if you're open to it, is that it does sometimes take a few people who think outside of this box to act differently, to sort of put a brake on things, who can sometimes inspire others to start to think and question, and that's important. I seemed to hear in your question or your comments earlier skepticism about that. I'm just wondering what you think.
Yeah.
If
So
that's open.
I am skeptical because I think it's dangerous to say that people who do things that are evil or immoral aren't thinking. There is a thought process that leads to it, often including indifference and opinions. What you're talking about is a disagreement. People who are willing to stand up and disagree to the overall consensus, which I agree that you need people to be able to do that. But to write off, well, they're not thinking, I don't agree with that. I think the very point is that they are ordinary people who can think and who do think, and that they get torn in and pulled into a world and an ideology that has its own logic, and that logic is against the morality and what we believe is correct. But to write it off as simply, well, they're not thinking about it, I think deeply underestimates the potential of many people to go down this path, and is, in my mind, very dangerous. So I don't agree with her concept that, oh, well, they weren't thinking about it. No, they were choosing to ignore it and be indifferent. And I actually think indifference is way more important, because that is, I think, a stream that runs through a lot of different, not just the Holocaust, but lots of different kind of acts of society, of being able to ignore things that you know that under ordinary circumstances you can't accept, but that you can become indifferent to. So I hear all the arguments. I understand exactly what you're saying. I just fundamentally don't agree that the people who do evil aren't thinking. I think they are thinking, and they're thinking in a way that we don't agree with, but they have their own logic. And that's the logic that we need to be able to argue against, rather than just say, well, it's automatic, because that allows you to kind of let people off the hook in a way they shouldn't be. They're thinking, but that thinking has to be changed. And the people you're talking about are really, they're people who are willing to stand up and disagree. And that's a different point.
I don't actually think that Arendt would disagree with you, Julie. I think that the term thinking for her here is, she's using it idiosyncratically. So if you look at page 49, and I think your point about indifference is really important to the way Arendt is putting forward her question of thinking. And it's a question of thinking, and it's a question of thinking processes. So at the end of Origins, in those final 15 pages, she actually is talking directly about logic and modes of reasoning and modes of rationalization and modes of deductive thinking that draw us towards certain conclusions. And I think fundamental for her is thinking about those thinking processes. How do we actually start to engage different processes of thinking that allow us to rationalize, that allow us to go along with, that allow us to stand up and speak out against? So it's not, so on page 49, there's, I think, 2 sentences. It's about 2/3 of the way down, where she says, the longer one listened to him, the more obvious became that his inability to speak was closely connected with an inability to think. But she doesn't just mean thinking, right? She's not saying he didn't think. That's not her point. It's not that, oh, well, they didn't think about it. She says, namely, to think from the standpoint of somebody else. And that's that empathetic gesture of thinking from the perspective of another. And so I think the question of indifference is important there, right? And indifference is a process where one rationalizes one's own position in relation to the other to maximize their own self-interest, right? So Eichmann
can I jump in on
is
that?
all about, just let me finish this just the sentence, because I think it's important. You know, it's about maximizing, you know, which is what Eichmann is doing, right? He wants to be successful. So he's very much thinking, but he's thinking in a certain way. And Arendt's trying to understand the way that Eichmann is thinking. And then she gives us, you know, this kind of thesis on the way Eichmann is thinking. You know, this idea that no communication was possible with him, not because he lied, but because he was surrounded by the most reliable of all safeguards against the words and the presence of others and against reality as such. So because he was so immersed in this bubble of ideology, of rhetoric, you know, this, you know, informed the way that he was thinking. about what it was that he was engaging in. So it's not fair to Arendt's argument to say that Eichmann wasn't thinking. That's not her argument. Her argument is that Eichmann is thinking, but that his thinking is this kind of, it lacks certain, capacities, and that it's this kind of logical, reductive process, right? That it's not a critical process of thinking. The kind of, she has a very specific understanding of thinking as this kind of self-reflective critical mode.
But that's inherently flawed, because people like Heidegger, who clearly she idolized and had a relationship with and thought was great, actually got also pulled into the Nazi ideology. So the concept that if you have the ability to think on certain terms or think in certain ways, that you are somehow immune or able to if you have this complexity of thinking, that you won't fall down this path. It's clearly not the case, because of the level and the intellect and the kind of people who clearly understood thinking in that terms. So
well, not for Heidegger. That's actually the Heidegger point's a good kind of example there, because so if you look at her letters with Jaspers about Heidegger, where she's very critical of his participation, and you look at Heidegger the Fox, the essay where she's, critical of Heidegger, she precisely attacks him on the grounds of thinking. She thinks that it's because he is so immersed in this kind of rarefied philosophical world of thought attached to ideal concepts that exist outside of reality, which is the same language she's using here to talk about Eichmann in a certain way. That he's safeguarded against reality by all these cliches. For Heidegger, it's just that he's safeguarded against reality by the world of philosophy, which is not allowing him to see what's unfolding in front of him and makes him susceptible.
In her other writings, she also says that ideology basically is the opposite of thinking. And that people who are trapped in ideologies are not thinkers. So in a sense, I totally agree with what Julia said, but I think that if you read Hannah Arendt more deeply, for example, in The Life of the Mind, where she actually explains what she thinks thinking is, it's a whole different concept. The desire to simplify it and say that her analysis of Eichmann was that he was a not thinker is basically too simple, and people like that. They don't want to go any deeper, but that's not what she's actually saying, because she says that you are bogged down in an ideology, you stop thinking, at least thinking in the way that she believes thinking is. And I think it starts with the concept of the human being, maybe from whether human being at his root is good or evil. And if she believes that basically there is a humanity to people, that the kind of events that occurred in World War II meant that these people, to some extent, stopped being human. And I think that may be part of what for her thinking means. That's my opinion.
Yeah. I think,
if I can, I'd like to put something on that, Sam.
Yep. Go ahead, Jason.
One thing that came forward in the idea of Eichmann always speaking in cliches is I've encountered that with two very close people to me who went through the American correctional system. And when they came out, they were kind of speaking in code, that there was these cliches. And I was raised by a therapist, and I was like, boy, that really sounds like talking points in therapy. That these were their path to coming back to the fold, as it were, and that we were re-indoctrinating them through these cliches. And to me, that really, drives back to the question of how Arendt discusses bureaucracy, and how she talks about how we've kind of, you get to the point to where the bureaucracy is running this discussion, running this dialogue for people, so that they don't have to think. That's one question I would have: are we going to that place?
Yeah.
If I could jump in for a second, may I?
I'm not.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Peter.
Peter, and then Jack. I think Peter was trying to speak before, and then Jack, jump in.
Thanks. Sorry. I just want to go back to Scott and Harold's points, and I put this on the chat that there were Rorschach tests that had been given to lots of the defendants in the the 22-person trial, the big trial, the famous trial, all of them but Streicher come out normal. And most folks who heard these results said that something was wrong with the test, that they refused to accept the idea that these people could be normal. And so the question is, or maybe not the question, but the revelation is we all try to protect ourselves. It's a natural tendency for human beings. I don't want to think that I could share the same species with these people, so they must be monsters. And when they fail to be monsters, then I'm threatened by that truth about them. That doesn't mean that they didn't do monstrous things. It means that unfortunately we don't get the out that something was wrong with them, so we have nothing to fear about ourselves. And that denial, that's our own denial to some extent. And I think that's something we need to confront, talking about thinking, talking about dialogic. We have to be dialogic with ourselves and think, how much are we refusing to accept these capacities in ourselves? When Enron, before it went belly up, destroyed the lives of people throughout California, that was a lot of people, I'm sure, didn't come to Enron saying, how can I ruin people's lives in California? They got caught up in a culture that seemed totally indifferent to the lives of those people, ruined them, and people laughed while that was happening, and they were simultaneously supported by accountants and lawyers, and the silence about what was happening was, an indictment of what happens when groups come together and create an alternative culture that's hard to escape from. So I think all of these things sadly point to how incredibly normal these kinds of things are, and what the Holocaust and the Nazis prove is just how horribly normal it can be when taken to its nth degree.
So, can I speak now?
So Jack and then Scott, yeah.
So I'm glad that Jason brought up the word indoctrination, and that indoctrination triggered in my mind Margaret's question about the mechanism. So we're living in a time actually where we're getting clear evidence of how social or political authority can actually influence and eventually indoctrinate large populations to be indifferent or even hate other parts of the population. That I think that the experience that Roger spoke about eventually having to just turn people off in his mind. That is, I'm not even going to try to continue to communicate with these people because they are shut down. That's a product of a kind of indoctrination that you mentioned at the very beginning when you talked about Eichmann being subjected to the propaganda, the Nazi propaganda. And the Nazi propaganda was, a very a 20th century phenomenon that actually led to much further roads, different roads of indoctrination. There was a lot of learning that people who exercised political or social authority learned from the way the Nazis indoctrinated the German people. And I think that's really very important. Nobody has talked about the word hatred. And hatred is a feeling, is something that occurs inside you that arises out of an indoctrination. Whether it's an indoctrination as a child within a religion to hate people of another religion or people of a different color, or whether it occurs later in life when it's a question of political or social ideology. Indoctrination is an important component of what we're talking about here, and it's clear that our friend Adolf Eichmann was very deeply indoctrinated to the Nazi ideology.
Scott, did you want to jump in there?
What strikes me is I'm trying to make some type of analogy with the horrors of the Holocaust with slavery here in America. So the slavery here in America, we had a divided nation where you could still think. So my guess is in 1860, if you lived in Savannah, Georgia, and you were anti-slavery, you might have been thought crazy. You might have been thought like a crazy Yankee. You might have been thought, but you were allowed to exist. You were allowed to still have a job and go about your business. You were just a crazy Yankee who believed that slavery shouldn't be around. So we had a country where you had slaveholders who, by probably any other measure, would be decent people. If you bracket out into slavery, they loved their families, they loved their kids, they loved all of that. But there was a critical mass of Northerners and people who were thought differently. So by having a nation where we had the permission to think differently, we ended up having a civil war over it, but things changed. And I've often wondered if the progress we've made since the end of slavery was accelerated. So let's say, for example, in 1900, let's say we had the moral values we have now, and there are still living elderly slaveholders, former slaveholders who are still alive. Would we have the Nuremberg trial, a type of Nuremberg trials for them? Would we be calling them radically evil? Would we be, I know that's, kind of a dystopian kind of, or historical kind of, thought experiment, but, how would we treat, how would we treat slaveholders if in 1900, we had the sensibilities we have today? I don't know. It's just something that makes me think, I guess.
Yeah. I think the American South in 1860 wasn't exactly the monolith that was suggested. There were many pockets of anti-slave sentiment throughout the South, to some extent based in religious communities. It was after the Civil War that kind of sentiment was less popular and less acceptable.
Oh, and I concur with that.
Yeah. Can I add something? This is Margaret. Piggybacking off just said to Scott. Also, in that example, I mean, when we talk about the beginnings of what's called feminism in this country, it's from women who were involved in anti-slavery movements, who then, and I'm obviously simplifying here, basically turned around and said, wait a minute, what about us then? And my point being, while these white women were slaves, they were not free in ways that we would think of. And they didn't think that way. They looked at the issue with reference to a different group of people. They were going about their lives thinking this was a good thing to do for these enslaved peoples, but had to go through that process in order to then be able to shine a light on their own situation. So, or it's often said that, you can come up with a process. The Federalist Papers, you can come up with the Constitution, you'll be owning slaves. How exactly was that the case? Was that a question of indoctrination? Was it indifference? I mean, I don't know. It seems, I don't see Arendt pointing to an answer to that. Please tell me if I'm wrong there.
Yeah. I think somebody else was trying to talk, so I just want to let them have an opportunity.
Mark, I have a question. May I ask a question?
Yes, you may, please.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering, when we talk about, when Arendt talks about thinking and the importance of empathy for the other.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about my own attitude toward Trump and his supporters and how I have no empathy for him or for them. And so I'm wondering if I too suffer from not being able to think. I ask it.
So I think that's a great question. I think it echoes some of the comments that have popped up in the chat box. I think a couple of people have brought up the impeachment hearings and Mitt Romney choosing to kind of make a statement and stand out as well. And I think the other question that we keep coming back to, which I think is really, it is at the heart of Arendt's wrestling with the concept of thinking in Eichmann, and a lot of her work, but is this question of indifference and this question of, I think it's a kind of maybe a two-pronged question, a question of what is it that allows some individuals to be indifferent to the suffering or cause of harm to others, and what, I think and the other side of that is I think we have in our thinking process, when we see evil, when we see something or think about something like the history of American slavery, or when we think about what it is that Eichmann did, there's a demand for understanding, right? There's a desire to understand the thought process, so, and to the comments about, American slavery, Arendt tried to make that comparison in the origins of totalitarianism. And she was, thinking about when she's talking about the holes of oblivion, and what it means to erase the individuals from appearing in the public realm, she's trying to think about that as an analogy. I think Roger can probably speak more to that comparison than I can, in the secondary literature that has been taken up. But I think this. So if I'm scrolling through the chat box, I think I want to pick out Joanna's comment here, where she says, "Is not cynicism the underpinning of this indifference?" I think this is a really good question, Joanna, and I think it ties a lot of these thoughts and questions together. Is it a point of thinking, albeit the possibility of being dangerous? I think the kinds of deeds committed by the Nazis can be attributed to the cynicism that allowed for indifference. So I think, there's a question of what allows for indifference, and cynicism for Arendt is a really important part of that. A disillusionment with the world that takes us out of the world, and that makes us susceptible to certain reductive modes of logical thinking, that kind of hardens us against the world. And then you say it is in some strange way easy and can be internalized by the use of Nazi cliches. And I think that's one of the points that Arendt is making here. She's making a claim on speech, right, as well. That the way that one speaks reveals their thought process, right? And what it is that's going on in their thinking. So by being attentive to the language that a person chooses to use in speaking, we have a kind of window into the process of thinking. And I just want to, I think it's important to emphasize here, though, also that Arendt's conception of imagining the world from the viewpoint of another is not sympathy, and it's not, I think, empathy in the common colloquial sense that we use it. I think it's an imaginative and empathetic capacity that we have in thinking, but it's not like Rousseau's feeling sorry for the animal that we encounter in the wild and see suffering. She's very much turning against that. And she's, I think, thinking about ways that we can orient our thinking toward the political questions and problems that are immediately in front of us, always. In that sense, and things like cynicism, which can make us indifferent to the world, turn us away from what is appearing immediately in front of us. I think let's go through some of the questions so Bob up at the top asked, do you want to jump in, Harold? Or is that Harold? I can't see.
I guess the disappointment a little bit here is the fact that some of us, at least me, when I'm reading Arendt, I'm trying to you build up ideas of how to approach things, and Origins tells you how a cultivated country like Germany got into the Holocaust, the business.
Yeah.
And now when you're talking about a person here, and I think some of us, as Roger kind of indicated early on, was how are we to communicate with this cult that as when you talk about a president who spoke at that prayer breakfast. Now you imagine what he was thinking of, what kind of a mind we were dealing with here, and people don't see that, and you're looking for ways of saying, how do I cut through it? How do I approach it? They're great. People go to, we know who they are. They go to church. They're decent, moral, upstanding people, and you're trying to figure out how are you believing the kind of terrible things that this guy is peddling. And that's kind of makes it disappointing when you do read something like this, where she's focusing on this kind of banality of people just going along with whatever the thing is at the time.
I'll just say two things to that. Pat, I think one of the fights I get in with people most often these days about Trump is, people are resistant somehow to the idea that he is actually, quite smart. He is. It might not be the kind, obviously I think there's a resistance to, how can he speak like this? How can he do these things, which I find so unpalatable, and they're not consistent with my own beliefs or my own political perspectives, but he knows what he's doing. And he's also quite funny. Right? I mean, it's not comedic in the sense, I know, I see the head shaking. But he has a certain sense of humor that plays very well with his audience.
It's a second grade
snide and snarky, that's all.
It doesn't matter what grade level it's at. For me, it plays well. I mean, he has a very good perception of his audience, and he knows how to mobilize his audience, and he's comedic, not in the way that Eichmann is necessarily, in that he's just, because he's not repeating cliches endlessly, although he certainly does use a good number of cliches and stock phrases, but he has a way of speaking in a form of free association that
I live in the
is
heart
the opposite of formal political speak. Now,
I live in the heart of Trump territory, and people compartmentalize. When I was a kid, I remember Mad Magazine, they had this series on Dufo. What a crazy guy. This Dufo used to do ridiculous things, but he was a crazy guy, so you can ignore that. It's the same with Trump. They ignore his stuff. Well, that's Trump, but on the basis of abortion, of immigration, of taxes, they support it.
Yeah, no, I'm not dissociating the two, but I'm saying if we want to understand Trump as a politician who occupies a public office, we can't just write off his way of speaking or his sense of humor or the way that he mobilizes his audience because we find it to be fundamentally in disagreement with our own political beliefs. And I think that this is a part of Arendt's critique of Eichmann that also gets her in trouble. She's not just, dismissing him as this anti-Semitic, unthinking monster. She's listening to him. She's looking at him face to face. We can't just write off. So, this is I think that desire to just write him off because it appears so other to many left or liberal people is one of the reasons he was able to win so well in 2016. And I think that's a difficult. I think it's a difficult ask.
Just
May I?
Someone has a mic on with some music in the background.
I think Scott has his mic on. Thanks, Roger.
May.
Okay. Oh, Scott, did you want to jump in? Is that the?
Yeah.
You're cutting out. I can't.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait. Am I on now?
Yeah.
Am I on now?
You are.
Okay. Yeah. I'll take the risk of speaking from somebody from the dark side of the force. Can you guys hear me? My screen's.
You're good. You're good.
Okay. Good. So I'll try to address a couple of these issues, I think, from Mark and Pat, and Sam's really, I think, point about Trump. So I'm speaking from somebody who, for the first 10 years of my life, lived in trailer parks, lived in a dysfunctional home, and then my parents passed away, and I was adopted by wealthy but Depression-era, pragmatic great aunt and uncle, and so then I lived the privileged life from the age of 10 on. So I've always been right of center, and I did not vote for Trump. It was the first election I didn't vote, but I find it very interesting on the speaking aspect because ever since I became politically aware with Ronald Reagan, Republicans all from a Democratic standpoint, Republicans have been, dumb. They can't speak. George Bush is a retard. He can't say things right. And Reagan's just, Reagan's just an actor, so it's all acting. And look how well spoken Obama is, which I think is kind of a little bit, has some undertones itself. But from the other perspective, and if you ask your typical Trump voter, they find in the speaking of, let's say, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, an extreme unauthenticity. They see, so if we had the same conversation with a bunch of my Republican friends, they would say, like, can you believe it when Obama goes in front of a black audience, he speaks like he grew up on the south side of Chicago. But then when he goes into the Hamptons, he speaks like a Harvard-educated lawyer. And then, when he goes to, and then Bill Clinton, when Bill Clinton, says, I feel your pain, he says it in a Southern drawl. But when he's, having, cocktails in Manhattan, he's speaking in his Yale vernacular. And, to somebody who's a Trump supporter, they find that just so, disgusting. And so or repulsive. So, you're absolutely right from the perspective of how people hear things. So, when a Trump supporter hears Trump, they're saying, yeah, he speaks exactly like I do. Yeah, George Bush, he speaks exactly like I do. I don't know what, half the words Obama is saying, and I don't know, and so from a typical Republic's. So I know I get long-winded. From a typical Republican standpoint, when we hear a Bill Clinton speak, when we hear a Hillary Clinton speak, or a Barack Obama speak, we see a total lack of inauthenticity. We see them just changing their language to fit the audience. And what you can say about Trump is, Trump shows up whether it's at a black church or whether it's a cocktail party on Manhattan, or whether it's in Georgia, he shows up in his blue suit and his orange hair, and he's not changing his dress to fit the scene, and so from his standpoint, they see him as authentic, and that doesn't mean good or bad. It just means authentic. And so, but I don't mean to. I know that's off of Eichmann, so I just thought I'd come at it from the dark side of the force.
If I can come in, I think we see what we want to see a lot of the times. I don't think that's that different in any of the things we're talking about. We come in already expecting the person we want to see, and there's some complications. And I don't know if Obama was fluent in this, but again, within the community of color, you code switch all the time. You have to, as a survival technique, because if you always speak one way, you're doomed in one or the other society that you have to live in. So not everybody has that freedom to have an authentic voice all the time. But I think what Scott's saying, which is very important to take into account, is this is how some people do hear him. I've heard other folks who are kind of single issue voters who similarly hear Trump in a certain way and have expressed the feeling that they don't like him, they wouldn't vote for him, but he was friendly and gregarious in the setting they watched him, which was speaking to his particular audience where he was pleasing many, making jokes that a lot of people laughed at, not because they were horrific jokes, but they had stereotypes in them that were seen to be not aggressive I mean, every stereotype is aggressive, but there were stereotypes that that audience could enjoy, not because they were the other, but because they were the people the stereotype was about. That doesn't make it better or worse. It just explains a different side of Trump than some of us who, in my case, despise him, refuse to recognize. And here I'm saying this intellectually, but emotionally, I can't stand him. I don't care how much I try to understand him. I don't care about understanding Trump. I care about understanding the Trump voter. That's a much more important thing for us.
So
that's the person.
I think that's a good way. And I think there are two points in there, and I just to tie it back a bit to the reading for today. One is, does the language a person uses, does it represent their capacity for thinking? I think that idea is very important to the way that Arendt is encountering Eichmann. And a lot of so people like to make fun of the fact that Trump speaks at a third grade level. And or he doesn't have an expansive vocabulary, or they just think he's dumb. And none of those critiques on the surface of it to me seem quite right. But I think the question, and to bring it back to Eichmann, the other question here is, and I think this came out in the impeachment hearings and was part of the arguments that were being made to impeach him on the House floor, was is he in his actions, in what he does, is there something that is fundamentally morally wrong? Sam, is it not just a question of breaking the law, but is there something that he's doing in his presidency that is morally compromised? And I think that's an incredibly difficult question.
Sam,
yeah?
Just really, really quick. There's an incredibly good article in Harper's February issue by a man named Thomas Meany called Will Trumpism Survive Trump? And it gives you an incredible insight into his people, and it's a bit scary.
Yeah. I mean, I don't, even the phrase.
I'll just say something.
I don't know who's talking.
This is Scott.
Okay.
Scott. I just want to say one thing really quick. Trump's people were the core of the Democratic Party until 2 election cycles ago. They were the man with the hard hat. They were the electrician on the poster. They were the coal miner. These are people who were the core of the Democratic Party until 2 cycles ago. And now, all of a sudden, they are the worst, evil, racist people in the world. And this absolutely has, if we want to move along in the society, we have to stop using words like Trump's people, and we have to stop using words like, or we have to start applying words like racist to people who are racist, and people, and it's just a huge mistake. These Trump's people were the core of the Democratic Party until
some of them were, so Scott, I'll just, I'm from Michigan. I come from a pretty working class union family. My dad was a member of UFCW for 47 years. Both of my brothers worked on assembly lines in Detroit for Chrysler. So did my grandfather. And I think it's actually a good example of the kind of very blue Democratic district, which historically had voted for the Democratic candidate, that switched really hard to Trump in the last election, which I think is part of Scott's point. And it's not that, those people, we make moral assumptions about people. I think there are different sets of questions here. Most of my family voted for Trump. Now, some people in my family are pretty racist and others aren't, which but I'm not going to make a blanket statement about Trump voters. I think there's a difference between the Trump administration and, Arendt's, encounter and coverage and reportage on Eichmann. But I think, if we want to think with Arendt, she gives us a set of questions that allow us to think about the moral claims that are being made. I think the question of whether or not, so one thing, our political parties right now are changing. We're in a flux period. The fundamental character of the Democratic Party and the fundamental character of the Republican Party are changing. And this is actually nothing new in the history of American politics. Our parties have historically changed over time, and we happen to be living in one of these flux moments, and it's painful because the Democratic Party, for example, is a kind of, it's a name that reflects beliefs that we are attached to, certain principles. And what we're witnessing is that the Democratic Party doesn't necessarily reflect the interests that it used to reflect for people who had allegiance to the Democratic Party. So my brother, who's an auto worker in Detroit, voted for Trump because he felt like Trump better represented the interest of the union than Hillary Clinton did. And that was, the one explanation he gave. And, I don't think that's necessarily an invalid point. If you listen to the State of the Union, Trump's entire framework was about being the party of the working class. We're going to have to go through this transition. And I think that it feels very painful for a lot of us. But I think the question of whether
Could I
or
make
not,
a positive point?
just one second, because we have to wrap up. Just the other side of that is, I think the question that a lot of people on the left or the liberal left that are, the question that they're raising is, does Trump's presidency fundamentally harm the institutions of American politics that give form to the country? Does the character of his presidency somehow, negatively and morally compromise the constitutional structure of democracy in America? And I think that's a very serious question. I think there are more questions. People, we have to stop because it's 2:32. I see somebody recommended Arlie Hochschild's book. I would strongly recommend that as well. I think it's a really smart book. Thank you for a really engaged conversation. It's fun to read Eichmann with everyone, and it's nice to have disagreement. It's in good Arendtian spirit to have different political perspectives and opinions, and I really appreciate everyone talking so openly and freely. So we're not going to meet next Friday on Valentine's Day, but we will meet the Friday after on February 21st. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt in the meantime, and I look forward to
Have a good weekend. Thank Henry Flower for us.
Oh, that's me. Yeah, that's the name of my computer. Roger?
The schedule on the website left off a chapter, so just a reminder, for Friday the 21st, we're actually going to read a fair bit of text. It's a lot of history, but 3 chapters, chapter 4, 5, and 6, the first solution, expulsion, the second solution, concentration, and then the final solution, killing. It's a lot of pages. If you don't get through it, we'll work our way through it. But I just want to it was wrong on the website, so I wanted to point that out.
Thank you.
Well, and we'll change the website. We'll update it soon. Craig will, but just
and we'll send out a reminder next Friday.
So you have 2 weeks. Just budget your reading a little bit more for a little more time if you haven't started it yet.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sam.
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.